Hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome again to Sword of Spirit Sermonator, episode 74. Sometimes I make mistakes when I put them up on YouTube. I can hardly remember from one to the next which episode. 74 is a lot. It seemed to went fast, but hopefully there'll be more to go. Anyway, I hope you thought about last week's message a little bit more. And the magnificence of the number 3 and how God represents things in Scripture. Tonight, we're going to talk about a book that is not often spoken of. In fact, in all the years where I've heard somebody say they had a word of knowledge or a word of wisdom or a word of teaching, word of prophecy, whatever, I can't recall any time that anybody pointed me to this book or from the book. And it's an interesting book because there's basically 5 parts to it, in a sense of how it breaks down. And most of the book, the first 4 chapters, are poems. And the last one is an outright prayer. And it's a book that was written also by a prophet. It was the prophet Jeremiah, or Yirmiyahu. You say, well, wait a minute, we're talking about the book of Jeremiah? That's a lot more than 5 chapters. No, we're talking about the book that directly succeeds that, the book of Lamentations. Okay? And it's not often quoted either. But we're going to go through it, and I hope we get through it, all of it tonight. And let's get a couple of facts out because there's not a lot known about the book of Lamentations. And there's been, I would say, enough of discussion over many years among scholars about who really was the author. I think we have enough of proof to show that it was, in fact, the prophet Jeremiah. Now, the book of Lamentations was written in around 587 BC. Now, who else wrote around the same time and was, in fact, in the same city under the same regime? Well, it was the prophet Daniel. You see, a lot of these things were not, well, this guy wrote this time and that guy wrote that time. Remember, I always remember the caution of the Elijah issue when Elijah had been, this guy was pretty brutally beat up, after the war and being chased, and every 5 steps of trying to kill a guy, just like they did with the Messiah. He got to a point where he was actually wounded. And he, woe is me, crying to God, I'm the only one. And God said, look, buddy, take it easy. You had a good run. You did good. But I want you to take it easy now. And we're going to sit you down. So not only did he sit him down, he elevated him up and took him up straight. He disappeared. He was just elevated, I guess you could say, into the heavens or into the Godhead, and removed from the earth. And God said to him, though, and I think I've said this more than a couple of times, he said, take it easy, man. Don't get in that position where you think you're the only one. There's 7,000 more in the city you live in. Well, he lived in Babylon, just like Daniel, and went through the entire regime of the Babylonian captivity. And, in his prophecy, Jeremiah is probably the number 1 most regarded prophet in the Jewish tradition and in the Hebrew scriptures. And I think it's something that we really need to take a good look at and see the parallels and see where, as a matter of fact, some of this takes us, okay? Because we're gonna refer back to Jeremiah a little bit in chapters 1 and 2, just to solidify what we're talking about. So, opening gate, Lamentations, we believe, absolutely was by Jeremiah. We'll cover that in a few minutes. But the name of the book itself, Lamentations, and the Jews typically back then would use the first word of the book as the title for the book. So in its original, it became known as Eka, or how. How did this happen? Or how would this happen? And the word was commonly used to mean something like, alas, this happened. In other words, how could this have happened? And we compare its use when we get into Lamentations in 2:1 and 4:1, and we can go back and see it was used similarly in Isaiah as well. But many also refer to the book as the book of Kinot, all right, Q-I-N-O-T, or Lamentations. And this is kind of how we arrived at that title. And when we think of Lamentations, all right, we think of suffering and restoration. Hopefully, when we see Ezekiel 38, we'll take a look at that downstream, because restoration is happening. There's a lot of things happening. And as a side, before we get into much into Lamentations, it was about a week or so ago. We saw a month or so ago. We saw the most unlikely gathering. We had kneeling a year or two ago that caused controversy and every other thing under the sun at a football game. And then a young man was injured, all right, one of their own. And everybody knelt. But they weren't kneeling in protest. They were kneeling in prayer. And so was everybody in the stands. Well, most recently, we just had a situation out at a college in the United States called Asbury University, where over a few days' time or weeks' time, 50,000 people showed up, okay, to solidify, to unify in prayer. So for all the things that we've talked about, all of the bad things in the world, the evil things that are going on, and yes, make no mistake about it, I don't use the word evil lightly. It's evil, and we are in the final throes of a final confrontation and battle that's been promised for so long, okay? And with such a strong anti-Christian, anti-believer, and anti-Jewish spirit floating through the world, not only the world, but our country, there are people now with major lawsuits to fight for religious freedom. There's one before the court today that this particular administration wants to, and this has nothing to do, I'm not giving a qualifier to this, I'm just giving you the facts, okay, that there are lawsuits by private Christian universities who, according to the administration or misadministration's mandates, are going to force even private universities that do not receive any federal funding at all privately funded, etc., to force them to allow whoever they want to go in whatever bathroom they want on their campuses under pain of fines and even imprisonment. Are you kidding me? So, there's an assault, and it's a multi-phased attack. As I told you, when we spoke of the beasts in Revelation, we spoke of the beast that came of the waters, which is the nations, which is the one world government for communism and socialism is being pushed right now. That agenda is going to clash very hard with the ecclesiastical, the anti-religious, anti-faith movement, such that they can make way, all right? And Jews and Christians are being persecuted all over the world, so that they can make way for the second largest religion, the beast from the land. And we've talked about that before. I'm not going to spend any time about it tonight. But what I'm telling you is this is lamentable, okay? Lamentable. There is an attitude that is really destructive, all right? And when we come to read, not only in Lamentations, but in Jeremiah, Jeremiah means, he lived to be 80 years old, by the means that Jehovah will rise up, all right? He will rise up, he will lift up. And if we will exalt the Lord. All of this has to do with fighting off not only the spirits that we've talked about, but a spirit of pride. You know, the Bible tells us that pride goeth before a fall. Well, pride, arrogance, and the attitude that we see in the world today, okay, is gone way beyond, all right? We're told to humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift us up. But that's not what's going on. There's a systematic beatdown of people of faith, people of prayer, all right? The family is being assaulted and called domestic terrorists. They won't call the guys that just blew up the police department in Atlanta the other day. They arrested 35 of them. Let's see what happens with that. They're going to let them go just like they let the murderers go in New York City? We don't know. We don't know. But there's an out-and-out assault on what is right in the world. Now, although, as I said, the author of the book is not named, we know that the traditions long before the Messiah all believed that Jeremiah wrote it, all right? And some scholars have doubted that, and they point to a couple differences here and there in some of the language or in the poetic style more than that, and some of the words and expressions. But they're used in the book of Jeremiah as well, which gives us a kind of tighter hold on it. And not only that, the prophet Jeremiah was known to compose different laments in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 25. All right? And there's even a more impressive array of similarities, that we're going to see when we examine the text itself. The differences then could simply be due to different circumstances under which the book of Lamentations was written, okay? And I think it's pretty clear that Jeremiah wrote it. And those in Judah, from Judah, all right, had always felt or believed, thought of themselves as God's chosen race, which they are, okay? And as such, they kind of felt that they would always experience good things, despite the fact that that behavior was not very good. He made covenants of blessings with them, but like prophecy and a lot of other blessings and things are conditional. I like to use the more common understanding of conditional. In other words, if you do this, then this will happen. That's inferential logic. That's when we infer properly, so that it says, if you do this, this will happen. Well, if you don't do this, then this won't happen. There was an example where it was prophesied that David, if he went to this city, he surely would die. And I've had some people actually come to me and say, see, the prophecy didn't come true, it was fake. I said, no, it wasn't. It was conditional. It said, if he goes to the city, he'll die. He didn't go to the city. Why would he die? He was told, warned, he didn't do it. Well, what do we know about this people, this Judah? We know that all 12 tribes, they were rebellious. They did what they wanted to do, and then they were warned, systematically warned, time and time again. We're going to see it. We're going to read a little in Jeremiah. We're going to see it here in Lamentations. And next week, we're going to study the book of Joel, the prophet. All the warnings were there, all right? And the blessings, as well as the curses, were conditional. Blatant disobedience would mean that the basic pleasurable or the good aspects or the blessings in the covenantal relationship would be replaced by punishment. Look, we all grew up. Our parents told us this and had nothing to do with disciplining. Let's just use a practical example. How many times do we know the age-old trick, don't touch the stove, it's hot, you'll burn your hand. Okay, Ma. Mom turns her back. Ah! Didn't I just tell you not? It was hot? Well, sometimes we just do it anyway. What drives us? Who knows? But the fact of the matter, without getting into actual punishments, that's punishment in and of itself. And to illustrate the point that we are typically, there's no the devil made me do it. I did it because I wanted to do it. All right? There are consequences for the things that we do, just as there were consequences for us in disobeying God, just like there were consequences because God is fair with Israel and with Judah. All right? So while these covenants existed, yes, they were conditional. The fulfillment of the promises of blessing could always wind up skipping a few generations because of the Israelites' disobedience. We've spoken about that more than a few times, where it said 3 generations and unto the 4th. Well, the 4th is hyperbole. It's just it's a poetic device, okay, that says for 3 generations, even to the 4th. In other words, it should be 4. It's 3, but it should be 4 because they really messed up. And we see that 3 generations pass. It's a funny thing. This country was established on the basis of religious freedom, all right, and liberty. And people came here, they worshiped as they wanted, and they, without fear of recrimination. And God blessed this country. But like Israel, and I'll say this, the only aspect that mirrors that, because remember, wherever Jewish folks go, right, they bring with them the blessing and also the curse on themselves and maybe whoever. It just happens. We all are part of that because we all have fallen short, all right? We have missed the mark in so many ways. But there were folks here that were of all different religious beliefs and persuasions. But to give just a parallel analogy, and I'm not equating the United States with Israel at all, or even Israeli people, all right, because they have suffered probably more than any people. Is some of it their fault? Sure. The book tells us that. But we also made a pact with God when we made our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence based on the fact that all men are created equal. That means in the sight of man and God. And we did okay for a while, all right, to get to that point. And like Israel, it took 3 generations, 70 years a generation, about 210 years. So when the Constitution was finally ratified in about 1799, I guess it was. Yeah. Well, you count about 210 years from then, and what do you got? 1899, 1999, 2010. Okay. We had a rough time, and we're paying for it now. All the things that you see going on in our country is for a blatant disregard for the principles of faith and for what God has set forth for us to do, just like Israel. In the book of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles give a full-up description, which we did talk about a week or so ago, of the moral decline of the kingdom of Judah, all right, in spite of the prophetic warnings, same ones we've had. And that would ultimately lead to its defeat and captivity, as we'll see in chapter 2 here, verse 17. When King Zedekiah rebelled against the Babylonians to whom Judah was a subject, okay, Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem in 2 Kings 24:20. And while he was besieging it, which we read all about a couple weeks ago, all right, the people inside were starving. And when he breached the wall, the Zedekiah soldiers managed to escape, according to 2 Kings 25, verse 4, but they were soon taken captive. All right? They destroyed most of Jerusalem, burnt the temple, carried all but the poorest people into exile. And we can read all of this again in 2 Kings 25. Now, in Lamentations, the poems here seem to have been composed after that happened. All right, because remember, Jeremiah was recording the book of Jeremiah. And then after the fact, we see the Lamentations. They're very heartrending when you contrast the former blessings and the strengths of Judah with the chaos and the suffering that their sin had caused. They brought it on themselves, just as we do. All right, this, the chosen, favored people, had lost everything, and they were in a hopeless position, humanly hopeless anyway. Everything that they had of significance was destroyed. And the poems also describe the ministry of Jeremiah, by the way, in Lamentations. He's sent again as a prophet to speak about this change of circumstances of God's people. All right? He did help to give them the necessary expression of their grief, which this was, and to comfort them in it. He encouraged his people, just as Daniel did, to think about the hand of God on them in punishment. It helped them basically to submit and penitently look at what we've done to ourselves. Look at the judgment that we deserve and look what we're getting. All right? And only after the people were completely humbled would they be able to think of restoration. So until that time, what happens is a lament. Now, laments were typically composed as poetry in the ancient world. Jeremiah had already written some in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 29, in chapter 9, verse 10, and verse 19, if you want to go check them. I don't necessarily think we're going to move in that direction here. I want to stick to this right here. But this book contains longer and more, much better known poems. As I said, there are 5, and the first 4 are what is called in literary devices as an acrostic, okay, or a poem in which each stanza begins with a successive letter of the alphabet, of the Aleph Beit, all right? Anywhere from Aleph to Tav. You've heard me say Aleph, Tav, Alpha, Omega, all right? It may have helped people in memorization, but it really shows how the poet was expressing all of his feelings from A to Z, so to speak. In other words, somebody said, I'm going to run it down here, A to Z. And that's what they did, and that's what an acrostic is. The first word or verse, it's very much a very artistic achievement, very specialized. But each of the 5, the verses begins with a successive letter from the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, the first verse would start with the Aleph, the second verse with the Beit, all right, the Gimel, Dalet, He, all right, and in succession, all 22 of the alphabet letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, basically what he was doing was writing a laundry list of grief, grievances, upsetness, pain, sorrow, disappointment from A to Z, okay? All the hurts, the fear, and he was opening up completely to God and man. The 5th poem, however, in Lamentations is not an acrostic. Why? No, because it's a personal prayer. There were no literary devices that we need to invent to have a personal prayer to God, just like Daniel did. And it doesn't work in an acrostic form, sorry. So there's very little systematic arrangement of subject matter in a personal prayer because it's spontaneous, it's emotional. No, they say poetry is a spontaneous overflow of emotion, according to William Wordsworth, the great romantic poet. Yes, but prayer is something much deeper. There's no form, fit, and function. There's no iambic pentameter or anything else, all right? Nor is it an acrostic. It is a prayer, all right? All the way up to a progressive conclusion. But that's the nature of grief. And the expression in the 5th chapter, the prayer, was that, an expression of grief. So, what's the best way to express grief? How to survive grief is to express it, okay? That's what I meant to say. What's the best way to survive it? To survive it, you have to express it. You got to get it out. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive inside and it'll kill you. It needs to be shared with others. It needs to be shared with God. Just like when we say God gives us a word or a promise, we express it, we articulate it, and all of creation hears it in one way, shape, or form or another. Okay? It's the same thing. We have to share that. It's a therapeutic value in working through the aspects of grief and sorrow. Destruction of Jerusalem and the lessons that God taught his people were so significant at this time that the Jewish people started reading the book. And they did it at an annual service to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. They didn't want that painful experience to be forgotten. Defeats need to be remembered just as successors. All right? I can tell you that for all the football games I've coached in my life, I remember all the victories, but I especially remember the few defeats and the pain that went with those. They haunt you. We can imagine what this haunting was like. To lose everything, all of the promises because of your own foolish behavior. That certainly is lamentable. All right? And we do the same thing today. Believers, they get a word from God, they get a blessing from God, and they start to get a little puffy. Everything's okay, everything's going real good, and they a lot of times turn it back on God. Sometimes it's called backsliding. And we fall into areas that we need to be awakened to and come to the realization, because, to what extent does God punish his people for their sins? What does he do today? All right? Yeah, we've been redeemed by the blood, and we don't bear retributive punishment for any sin that we commit because we're under that grace, and we're living under a little different covenant than the Jews of 586 or 87 BC. But there is time when there's punishment. 2 Peter 2, verses 4 through 10 lets us know about that in the next life. Past sins come. We have to be reconciled. Everything has to be out in the open to be fully gone. Because even though we're believers, we still oftentimes come short of the glory of God. Oftentimes we sin, which means we miss the mark. Okay? All right. So with that, let's begin to talk about the book of Lamentations in chapter 1. We see a description here of the destruction of Jerusalem. How? Remember Ekma, what we said before? The word how, alas. How did this happen? How does a city sit solitary that was full of people? How is it that it has become a widow and that she was great among the nations and a princess among the provinces? How is she become nothing more than a tributary? She weeps sore in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks among all her lovers. She hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They're become her enemies. Sounds a lot like what's going on in Israel today and what's going on in our country as well. Okay? Judah's gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwells among the heathen and finds no rest. All of her persecutors overtook her between the straits, and those of the way of Zion do mourn. Because none come to the solemn feasts. All her gates are desolate. Her priests just sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief. Her enemies prosper. For the Lord afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. That's the Babylonian captivity. We're going to take a break. Be back in a minute.